Welcome to today's episode of The Square. We are doing something we have never done before, but before we get to that, I'm really excited to be joined by Samantha Flores, our Director of Research and Innovation. Good morning.
Good morning.
And with Varun Kohli, who is our Director of Sustainability. Thanks for being here, Varun.
Thank you, Brad.
Albeit a little bit virtually from New York.
Yeah.
So we are going to be doing a series over the course of 3 or 4 episodes and doing a deep dive, pun intended, on the topic of water. And now today we're just going to skim the surface. There's going to be so many bad water puns, and I apologize ahead of time. About the topic of water, kind of set an overview for some of the different things we're going to be talking about in the various episodes. But I'm really excited to have the opportunity over multiple episodes to kind of just really tackle a topic as important as water. So let's talk a little about that. I was actually reading an article from like 10 years ago, so I think it's probably even more acute now, but that literally the gold water index, water has become more valuable or has become more scarce than gold. What is it about water, aside from the obvious of us, needing it to live on a day-to-day basis? What is it about water that makes it such a tricky thing when you are designing, Sam?
It's just so interesting because there are lots of ways that we can design our buildings to save water, reduce water usage. There are a lot of ways that we have been messaging to people to reduce water usage in their normal everyday behaviors. But there are also ways that we just don't even think about our normal behaviors using water, like clicking yes, purchase on Amazon, and all the water that is associated with that purchase. So, when we think about designing water into the building, we also have to really think about how humans use and behave and act in those buildings, what they use, what they consume. It's really, and then beyond that, we got to think about the larger ecosystem, where that water is coming from, and what all is pulling from those sources. So I think it's such an interesting topic because, as an everyday consumer, I don't usually think about what my actions are doing and how they're tied to the water usage.
Sure. Varun, I know that there's advertising campaign after advertising campaign that are kind of based around the residential uses of water and, the guy that leaves the hose on and floods the front yard or, replacing faucets and things like that. But when you go beyond that and you really think about it in a business and industrial sense, what is it that, from a sustainability aspect, what is it that you are looking at in terms of how water affects a design?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I was going to mention that we often only think about residential use, but in industrial processes, right, like in manufacturing processes, there is so much water that is used. Now, that's not something that we typically engage with as architects. But if you think about the types of buildings that we work on, including aviation, including data centers, where there's massive amounts of cooling, right? And how do you cool? A lot of these systems are using cooling water towers. And there's so much water that's being consumed, especially in data centers, just as part of the cooling of those data centers. So there's all kinds of usage of water on a day-to-day basis, and we've got to find a way to reduce these systems. Whether it's a more efficient system and how that impacts in our buildings, or conservation, or trying to reduce the amount of potable water, right? So that's why we get into these recycling of existing water that comes into the building, or trying to retain the stormwater that comes in, that we get as rainfall. So every kind of strategy has to be looked upon in each of these buildings, and really understanding how buildings vary and what kind of water usage or consumption is associated with each building type.
One of the things that you and I talked about as we were preparing for these episodes, I found a term called WSUD, which was water sensitive urban design. You were talking about a term SUWD. It seems like there's awareness in pockets of wanting to have a change, wanting to promote a more water sustainable design. Is there a lack of kind of a single entity or a cooperation, or how do those different entities work together?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And there probably is, right? We're not dealing with the urban infrastructure at the moment as architects, but if you can imagine, what's happening lately is twofold. You see scarcity of water at times, and sometimes in the same geographical region, you will kind of experience scarcity at certain times, and certain times there's inundation. We are experiencing a lot more cloudbursts and pluvial flooding and the nuisance flooding, and that is happening because of cloudbursts. Urban infrastructure is not designed to take 3-4 inches of rainfall in an hour. And so cities like even New York get flooded when we experience that. So that is one side of water. The other side of water is when we need water, we need to conserve it. And the thought process is really for us to come together and start thinking about water from all aspects: the usage, the storage, the reduction in potable water use, and managing stormwater systems, both from building scales and how it links back into campus or city scale. So it's a really an approach should be more systems thinking rather than one aspect of water.
Oh, I love that. There's you talked a little bit about this earlier, Sam. The idea. I think something that has gotten a lot of traction, particularly in the last several years, is the idea of a carbon footprint. Right? It's like how what are our actions when I go on a flight, or how when businesses buy credits or whatnot to offset their carbon footprint. The idea of, I've heard it termed virtual water, I've heard it termed water footprint, where you're thinking about the idea of how much water is used when you buy a product or when you execute a business, trade or something like that. Is there a system that is measuring kind of universally that idea from a research innovation standpoint that measures the water cost of things?
We're looking into that and trying to understand some building typologies, water footprints. A building typology that we are looking into, and Varun mentioned earlier, is data centers, because they do use a lot of water, and tracking the water footprint is a little bit easier with a data center because a lot of their systems, they use water in 3 ways. One, to cool the building and reduce humidity, and all of the systems that are providing water, using water in that way. 2, they're also using water through the energy source that's provided to them. So it may be that their energy source is coming from hydroelectric power. It may be that it's coming from geothermal. It may be that it's coming from a different energy source that is using water in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And then 3, data centers also have water treatment plants and water suppliers that are supplying water, and there's inefficiencies in those suppliers that we can start to track.
Right.
I think it's challenging because it's not the typology or the building itself that is in charge or can direct where all of this water is going, that there are multiple players. But even just to be aware of what those multiple players are, who they are, and how they're supplying water to the building or how it's being used will help us to create that water footprint, and then also help us to know, across geography of the U.S., for example, where we are putting buildings that are using large water footprints versus smaller water footprints, and if we're making certain areas or regions more thirsty by using their freshwater sources through our building needs.
You mentioned that a little bit when we were talking just earlier, Varun, about the idea of thinking not just about the building design in terms of capturing water or in terms of, retaining water and being sustainable in design, but also the effect the building has on the grid and the surrounding landscape, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, we have seen, and I can speak to some of the experience I've had even in New York City, right, where areas of the city which are really well designed with softscapes that can absorb a lot of the rainfall water, you still see pockets of, smaller hardscapes that could get inundated, get flooded during rainfall events. And why is that happening? Well, you've got buildings that are collecting stormwater at the roof, bringing it down to maybe a smaller detention tank, and then it flows into the city stormwater system. All of that, the systems that is being designed is no longer being, capable of handling that kind of volume. So the idea of, understanding, okay, we can try and fix certain things at the building scale, right? You can increase the infrastructure. First of all, I mean, the challenge is also with existing buildings. But when you're designing new buildings, you can obviously account for that. You can account for not just the typical rainfall or historical data of rainfall, but look to what is the impact of climate change, right? What is the predictions or projections of the change that we're going to see and design for those? Once that has been taken care of, how does that then feed into the stormwater? If the city's stormwater infrastructure is not capable of handling that amount of water, wouldn't it be helpful for the building to be able to retain more water, whether it's through blue roof systems or cisterns, or having other water bodies or around the building that can hold off the water and not push everything onto the city infrastructure, which then can back up and overflow. So there's a lot of these strategies that we're seeing happen. There's, I keep going back to this impact of climate change because we are seeing a lot of that happen, right? And I'll give you a good example of how certain designs are taking care of that. And one of the good examples I saw was in Denmark, where they have, designed for more resiliency and flooding. And, some of the parks that they have designed, they've actually created a bathtub basketball courts. And what that does is, it converts into literally a bathtub when it rains a lot and holds the water in place and then drains out after the storm event.
Wow.
Right. So it's a multi-use space. So we can create those kind of urban, spaces that can soak in as much water as or hold it in place and then release it gradually. So there's different strategies we can apply both at building and urban scales.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the episodes that we're going to be addressing over the next series. So the first, or I guess this is the first episode. The second episode is designing when there's too much water. And so one of the things that I heard, we were, I forget where we were coming back from. I think it was actually coming back from the UK. And I was talking with somebody about how New York, so a little bit close to home for you, Varun, is actually sinking a very small amount every year. And I started doing some research, and there's cities all over the world, and not just things like Venice, where you kind of automatically think about it, but Jakarta, Bangkok, Shanghai, Mexico City, New Orleans, Manila, Ho Chi Minh City, like some of these, like the world's biggest cities. And it's due to a combination of factors of the weight of the city, the, pulling of groundwater, so you're creating space for it to sink, and then a few others that we'll get into when we actually have the episode. But I was actually really surprised that something like that, I mean, again, you hear about Venice and you hear about these, popular, really tourist cities that here, but some of these big industrial cities, I had no idea. It seems like it's not just a really big problem that needs to be solved, but it's also a problem that I don't think there's a lot of chance of reversing. I mean, you can't re-pump up the cities. So how do you begin to tackle a problem like that?
Varun may be able to answer this question a little bit better, but one thing I'll also mention is that there are island cultures that are going to be completely gone because the islands themselves are going to sink. And that's a whole culture.
Yeah.
And, that's something that's pretty devastating, especially when you look at some of these island cultures who don't even have water infrastructure on their island.
Yeah.
And they're delivering water house by house, place by place, restaurant by restaurant. So it's just kind of interesting that they're being overloaded with water that's unusable for them. And then they also have to deliver in water to be usable. So, it's not only our big cities, it's our small cultures as well. But designing our cities around, better water infrastructure is obviously key. And I think Varun was hitting on it, that it's not just take a look at the city, how can we redesign our urban infrastructure, but it's the city scale, building to building scale, the building scale itself, And then what do we do on the interior of the building, all the way down to user behavior? All of those things together are going to help us save water where we can. And it'll save billions and billions of gallons per day when we can start to pinpoint different areas where we can save.
Yeah, I mean, Varun, it's particularly being there in New York, it's not like you're going to be tearing down some of the big skyscrapers that have been built, just because they weigh too much. So how do you begin to address that challenge and look at ways, if there are ways, to reverse it?
Yeah. Now, this is one of my favorite topics because I was neck deep into this resiliency work in my previous position at Battery Park City Authority. And, you're right that the cities are sinking. And in some places, it's worse than the other because it's not simply about, like, New York City is sinking, but it's a very small, I think it's some millimeters every few years, right?
Right.
But you compare that with the rising sea level, that's what, you put them two together, that's where the problem is. So, Jakarta definitely is at a point where they have no option, but they're, Indonesia is now rebuilding a new capital city. They're literally vacating, Jakarta. In New York, when we were working on these coastal resiliency projects in Lower Manhattan, the assessment is, and this is based off of IPCC, reports on climate change analysis and a panel that is appointed by the mayor's office called the New York City Panel of Climate Change. They have come up with recommendations, and their assessment is that by 2050s, we might see the sea level rise in the 90th percentile assumption somewhere around 30 inches.
Wow.
So imagine, the sinking might be very small, but if 30 inches of sea level rise is a huge, huge change, and you couple that with these, increasing storms and storm surges and rainfall, that is a huge problem. So there are responses happening across the world. New York City is leading some of that resiliency work. And it's not an easy task, right? Trying to create prevention of flooding through, whether it's hard walls or berms or, weaving through some of the most dense urban environments is a huge challenge. But that's what we're doing. That's what's happening in New York. That's what's going to happen in places like Singapore. All of those cities have to protect their assets, and we know the change is coming.
Yeah.
So the sinking part is one, but I think the sea level rise is going to be the other huge challenge.
Well, the next two episodes after that are talking about designing when there isn't enough water, like you think Phoenix or Vegas, and then also the what would I guess be the fourth episode after that would be designing for extremes. So there are some places like Phoenix and Vegas and various places that they just don't ever get enough water. Like there's the Colorado River Project that's been in the news a lot, but they just don't have enough water. And then there's places like Vegas or Madrid, Spain, or even Beijing, where they have periods of drought, but then they have periods in the rainy season where it's just a ton of water that they get. And they almost both cause as much destruction, or there's big a problem because there's the retention of it. Is there? I was reading about the Cape Town Day Zero crisis, where they got within like months of just having zero water. How is that? I mean, it was a scary thing to read about. Fortunately, it didn't happen, and they were able to refill some of the reservoirs. But I think it hits home the idea of water scarcity being a huge problem, obviously, and how is it that design, and not just the building design, but the urban planning and whatnot, how does that kind of mitigate that as a real threat?
Yeah. Well, that's a huge challenge, right? Because you're pretty much relying on a natural event. We're waiting on rainfalls to support our urban centers. There's so much you can do with water management at the regional scale and diverting water and, like the Colorado River issue. But short of that, there's really, things we can do, or perhaps, trying to retain water for longer term. And I would kind of go back to, some of the ancient or vernacular strategies in places like India, where the that region is used to receiving a huge amount of rainfall during monsoons and then being absolutely dry until the next season, right? And how do you do that? And if you look back in some of those, traditional architecture, you'll see these step wells where a huge amount of water was collected. In some ways, try to shade it as much as you can so you can avoid evaporation. But these are deep wells, and throughout the year, the water keeps going down, but you have the steps that brought people closer and closer to the water until the next season of monsoons, and then the water came back again. So, in the modern city, it has to be a combination of things that happen at the urban scale. But like we were talking about before, maybe every building needs to, has to require to have a certain amount of detention for a longer period. And, these systems are networked and support each other in some way. There's so much limitation on how much we can do if you don't have enough rainfall. Yeah. So that's a real challenge.
I think something that Varun's hitting on are some traditional ways to manage water through design. And I think that those are really smart to think through. I think being in the modern world, we often think that software solutions might be the answer. And I come from the user perspective and thinking about how IoT and AI will help us better understand leaks in our buildings or user behavior around water in our buildings. But AI also, to train an AI model takes a lot of water. And to train multiple AI models through all of our buildings, that's also going to take a lot of water. And our data centers that train those models use about 57% fresh water.
Yeah.
So, thinking about what Varun's saying with some of these more traditional design methodologies versus some of the more high-tech software solutions, I think is smart and interesting because we are going to have to change the way that we design our urban spaces,
right?
Rather than relying on technology to help us do it all. It can do some, but we have to weigh the benefit if it's using a lot of water to get the AI to tell us where we're using too much water.
Yeah.
What's the trade-off?
I think it's interesting. I think you're hitting on something we'll probably have discovered with cold hard fact by the time we get to the end of this series, which is there is no one solution, right? There's not even 3 or 4 solutions. It's going to have to be a balanced effort in order to have kind of the best bang for your buck, the best value in terms of effort. I am curious about one thing. As we were doing research, and Adam, our senior producer for TheSquare, sent me a bunch of articles on this. Is desalination a possibility for cities that are close to the ocean? I think traditionally I've only seen like the plants in LA, but traditionally it's too expensive or it uses too much energy. But there are other places that are doing it. I think Israel was one of the places where they're doing it and it's incredibly cheap. Is that a real possibility?
I mean, we would hope so, right? I think that's really the hope. We're surrounded by water everywhere, but we can't drink it because it is salinated water.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the hope is that it would help us, but the infrastructure for desalination plants also takes water to build. So again, it's one of those trade-offs. Are we using water to make water? And then in that vein, how important is it that we desalinate this water and get it to our cities? Yes, it's important. But are there other trade-offs down the line of ecosystem destruction that we might be facing that maybe isn't a problem now when we're trying to desalinate, but will become a huge problem later on? I mean, we've got to weigh all of those options.
We don't want to kick the can down the road,
right?
And also, Brandon, I think just to add on, I think that cost prohibition it's an issue. Like it's not a inexpensive solution. And if you think about water scarcity at the global scale, it's the global south that faces a lot of those problems. So how do you fund those kind of desalination plants in countries where they can't afford to build those? The cost is a barrier.
Yeah. So we've kind of talked about the 3 or 4 kind of topics that we're going to dive into in the series, but I think what it's ultimately going to come back to at least as an element in each of the challenges, is user behavior. And again, a lot of times when you think water conservation and user behavior, you think I'm going to spend a little less time brushing my teeth, or I'm going to take a shorter shower. I'm going to water my lawn one time less a week. And it's not that that's not important. I'm not downplaying that. But we're kind of addressing a different kind of user behavior, which is how people design buildings, how they run those buildings, how they think about what happens in those buildings. I wonder if there isn't a little bit of an awareness thing, Varun, when, people, they maybe just, they hear about the problem of water scarcity, and then the next day it rains, and it's like, oh, okay, well then it's not as big a deal. Like, is there a perception problem?
There is, and this is similar to climate change issue, right? When things don't happen abruptly, there have been so many people denying this change, right, for the longest time, and now we're starting to see a bigger impact. I think the water thing is the same. It's similar, where you might see inundation of rainfall one day, and you think, well, water is not a problem. But what's happening with climate shift is that rainfall is becoming sporadic, right? Like California had this massive amount of rainfalls after years of drought, and that water couldn't be retained. So there's all of these kind of systemic changes that we're seeing that is not as easy to grasp. So I think it's not a silver bullet, right? Like, we have to talk about human behavior. We use technologies to help, whether it's automated faucets or things like that, or just messaging or policies. We have to use all aspects and all kind of tools in our resources to help change the human behavior.
I wonder if that's a awareness thing. We were talking about earlier about, like, Google, when you go to buy a flight, they'll tell you what the carbon footprint is of that flight, right? But if there was something when you went to click the button on Amazon that said how much water you were using.
Yeah, I mean, it would be really great for the end user to know and be aware. I think there's a lot of power in the end user, because a lot of our buildings leak. We lose about 50% of freshwater supply from leakages in buildings.
Yeah.
We lose another 25% from overuse. So that means turning on your kitchen faucet and waiting for it to heat up.
Yep, which I 100%
That's what I do.
Yep.
And not using that water elsewhere. I mean, that's 25% of our freshwater supply. That's about 10 billion gallons.
Wow.
When you do the math. And that's every day.
Yeah.
That's not just over a period of time. That's every day. And I think too, something that Varun said just now really kind of hit home for me with climate change, how it sneaks up on us.
Yeah.
And we don't really realize the effects of it until sometimes it's too late. I think about our urban heat islands, and I think about, really people weren't paying attention to the heat, or were negating that heat was an issue until we started seeing summers where the death toll was rising so much. It was becoming an increasingly high amount of death rates from heat.
Yeah.
I would hate to see the same thing with water. Because it seems like we could potentially be on the same trajectory, that we've created these cities and designed these cities to empower people and to have, better lives and support. But they're causing such disruption in our ecosystem. How can we, we've already done a lot of research into heat management and what we can do to change the way that we design our buildings and our urban infrastructure to accommodate better public spaces to reduce heat. I wonder if we can do the same, and I definitely think we can with water for both conservation and supply.
Well, I'm really excited to get into this discussion over the next several episodes. Thank you both for being here. I know it's going to be an interesting conversation where hopefully we'll learn a fair amount. I am curious, just as we kind of leave this episode, are there things that you're hoping to discover, things that you're wanting to make people aware of, kind of overall as we get into these episodes? Sam, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think a lot of the times when we think about these big issues, Sometimes we put all the onus on the user, and the user definitely, the end user, me, you, Varun, we can definitely play our part in play our role in conserving water or reducing our use. But I would like to see solutions across the scales that we mentioned. What is a solution at a building scale, at a company scale? What can companies do to conserve water? What can our cities do? And what types of policies are being put into place?
Yeah.
And that's really what I would like to not only discover through these discussions, but put that out there in the public so that we all know collectively how to work on this issue together.
Varun, how about you?
Yeah, I think something similar, but I would love to see us designers, architects, engineers, really start thinking about water in a more holistic way. Right now we tend to segregate the water conservation strategies on one side, the stormwater management systems on one side. We don't really think of it as a full cycle. And that's where I think we can really have an impact, start thinking about it in systems terms in a more holistic way, even going beyond our buildings, looking at our sites, looking at what the infrastructure is doing, and then design things that are really in sync with everything else around it. That's really my expectation and hope.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Varun, Sam. Thank you so much for watching. We'll have links to all of the various episodes of this series in the description. And if you have any comments, please feel free to reach out. Until next time, thanks for watching.